luck, we'll do this until the museum reopens and we can go back to Lockheed Martin's place. Thank you very much, Rick, for all the work you're doing on all these Zooms that we've been having. And without further ado, I guess we'll let Chuck get started on his talk tonight.
All right, I'd like to welcome all of you to the Glenn O. Martin Maryland Aviation Museum Speaker Series. My name is Chuck Trainor. The first slide that'll come up will say Charles Trainor. If you call me Charles at the museum, nobody will know who you're talking about because it's me. So having said that, I received a battery of questions. Can you give us a little background information? So where did I grow up? I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland. And I've lived here all my life for all 73 years. And I went to Poly. I graduated from Poly in 1965. That was when it was still on Calvert Street in North Avenue. It was a great place to go to school. I had a lot of fun there. I'm glad I went there. Okay, then. Where did I work? I worked at a hobby shop for a time. I also worked in warehouses. I also did light delivery. And for about half of my life, the last half of my life, I was a security officer. My last job site was actually at Glenn O. Martin plant. I worked for GS4. And after that, before that, I worked for Guardsmark. And then when I had a stroke, that's when I retired. I have no military experience. I joined the museum when one of my next door neighbors visited with me one day, so he brought me down to the museum. He paid for my membership. I guess that was about 5 or so years ago, and I've been a member ever since. I guess I'd like to dedicate this talk to him. That would be Ricky Ford, who died a couple of months ago. He was my next door neighbor. He said I was a mentor for him since we lived next door. So I was very flattered by that. I figure I'd like to thank him for that. I'd also like Ted and the board of the museum to give me the opportunity to do this and try to explain things you never learned in high school because they just don't teach this kind of stuff and they don't teach it with the kind of detail that I'm going to speak of when we get into this discussion for the Battle of Midway. So before getting started, I'd like to say, if you have any questions, if you have a pad and a pencil, you can all write your questions down so that I know when we get to the end, if you have anything you feel I haven't explained, then maybe I can clear that up for you. So having said that, let's start with the first slide, if I can, Professor.
Before we do that, if everybody could mute so that we don't get any feedback or pets or televisions in the background, just mute yourself. Unless you have to talk, you can always unmute if you have a question later on. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to introduce the gentleman that was just speaking. That was Rick Fratelli. He is going to be engineer tonight, and if it wasn't for Rick, we couldn't do this because he's been keeping me focused on this thing, condensing the program, and hopefully it'll be coherent and logical. So what we're going to talk about are going to be the commanders during the Battle of Midway. That will be the United States Navy and the Japanese. We'd also talk about the ships and the aircraft. And then if we get past that, we'll be at 0400, June 4th, 1942, flight deck of the Chicago, and we'll take it from there. Okay, Midway in 1942 was a strategic part of the United States defensive plan. It was our westernmost outpost in the Pacific for the simple reason that the Japanese had conquered the Philippines just 2 days earlier to the Battle of, about a month earlier than the Battle of Midway actually got started. The Philippine Islands had fallen to the Japanese when they finally occupied the Bataan Peninsula. The Japanese tried to capture the South airfield of Port Moresby and the island of New Guinea. And they were turned back at the Battle of the Coral Sea. The reason I mention that is the Coral Sea is kind of key to what happens to the Battle of Midway. but we'll get to that when I start talking about the ships. So where exactly is Midway? Well, obviously it's kind of midway in the Pacific. It's about 1,000 miles west of Hawaii. Well, if you get an airplane and fly, and it takes you about 5 hours to get to Hawaii. If you stay on that airplane for about another 2 hours, you can reach Midway. Of course, visitors to Midway is limited. It's only people who actually run some of the installations on the island. In addition to that, you have to be naturalists because it's a wildlife preserve. So Midway is not really geared to see a lot of tourists, but it is possible to get there. There are tour groups that about 16 people go out at a time, and you get to walk on the sands along the airstrip where history was made on June the 4th, 1942. All right, here's an aerial view. Actually, that's a satellite view of Midway. You can see where the airstrip used to be on the small island. And then you have the larger island. And this was where most of the action took place. At the time of the Battle of Midway, there were about 125 airplanes based there. It was a combination of fighter planes. There were some torpedo bombers. There were some heavy bombers. There were also some seaplanes based out of Midway, and the seaplanes were providing reconnaissance to go out and see if they could find out where the Japanese were. All right, let's take a look at who was actually in charge of this show. So we'll start with Admiral Chester Nimitz. Nimitz kind of got a hot potato dumped in his lap. He inherited the job as the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet as a result of the Pearl Harbor attack. He was the commander of the Office of Bureau of Navigation on the West Coast. And from there, Ernie King, who was the commander-in-chief of the United States Navy, tapped him and said, Chester, I want you to go out there and take command of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. You're going to call all the shots. So he would determine which ships went where. And he delegated to ships to the Alaskan frontier, to the Southwest Pacific, and also to the Central Pacific, where this battle was about to take place. So Chester Nimitz was the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Navy in the Pacific during World War II. So moving on to Admiral Ray Spruance.
Hold on.
Okay. Station break.
There we go.
All right, thank you, Rick. Okay, Ray Spruance was born in Baltimore, Maryland. That's not where he ended. He grew up in Indiana, and he eventually entered the Naval Academy, where most of your commanders came from, especially anybody who achieved a high rank went through Annapolis. So in the course of his career, he commanded 3 destroyers, and then eventually he hit the big time. He got the battleship USS Mississippi, and that was one of the pre-dreadnoughts. It was laid down during World War I, although it didn't see any action. And for a while, it was also in the Atlantic. All right, let's move on from there. He commanded Cruiser Division 5, which was 5 heavy cruisers, and they formed a screen of one of the task forces of the ships as they went through the early battles in the Pacific. It wasn't really, he didn't think he was the first choice. The real carrier admiral that we had was William Bill Halsey. Don't call him Bull. He did not like to be called Bull Halsey. He much preferred Bull. But unfortunately, just about 2 weeks before the Battle of Midway broke out, he broke out too, but he broke out in shingles. So it made him extremely uncomfortable and incapable of commanding. So they beached him. So he went to, or Nimitz went to Halsey and he said, Bill, who should command these ships? He said, well, given the choice, because I know you don't have a real carrier admiral, let's give Ray Spruance a shot at it. So there, that way he inherited the 2 aircraft carriers, which do most of the fighting in the Battle of Midway. That would have been the USS Enterprise and the USS Hornet, which we'll get to in a few minutes. But also we have up here Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. And Jack Fletcher was initially initially, Frank Fletcher commanded the Task Force 17, which fought the Battle of the Coral Sea. There were two flat tops under his command. One was Yorktown, which we will see in a few minutes, and the other, the Lexington, which the Japanese unfortunately managed to sink. But the presence of the two American carriers forced the Japanese to turn back. They frustrated their attempt to capture Port Moresby, and the march of the Japanese juggernaut had come to a halt right there at the Coral Sea. That's why the Coral Sea is important. All right, let's see who's on here next. Admiral Mark Mitcher. Mark Mitcher was the captain of the USS Hornet, and he was slated to fleet up. That means he was going to be promoted. Oh, I lost everything. Okay, I'm back. Technical difficulties here. All right, Mark Mitcher was the captain of the USS Hornet. He was in command of the Hornet when the Hornet, accompanied by the Enterprise, went to within 700 miles of Japan and launched 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers, and they were the first bombers to strike at Japan. It was probably the first offensive move made by the United States Navy in World War II, other than raiding a few selected islands in the Central Pacific. So Mark Mitcher was an aviator, and he was a true carrier admiral. He had a lot of experience doing that. So it was decided, even though he was slated for relief, he persuaded Admiral Nimitz to leave him in command of the Hornet. So he would pretty much orchestrate what the Hornet did, even though Frank Jack Fletcher was the commander of Task Force 17, which the Hornet was built around. All right. Let's take a look at Captain Elliot Buckmaster. He was a skipper of the USS Yorktown. That was CV5, hull number 5. He became the captain of the Yorktown when the ship was launched. He became the captain of the Yorktown in February of 1941. The Yorktown had been around a little bit longer than that, but he commanded her from the time she was launched until the conclusion of the Battle of Midway, and we'll see why he wasn't in command of the Yorktown after the battle anymore. All right, and we've got a pretty impressive lineup of the second, and Admiral Isiroko Yamamoto, and he must have had a crystal ball, because these are some of the things he had to say about the war with the United States. He said, "If I am told to fight regardless of consequence," he is reported to have told Prince Kinoi, who was the Japanese prime minister, "I shall run wild considerably for the first 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second and third years." So he pretty knew that if the war wasn't a quick war, there would be problems down the road for Japan. And Admiral Yamamoto was also a naval attaché in Washington. And he spent nearly 4 years in the United States. And he had a pretty healthy respect for its military and its industrial capacity. Unlike some Japanese who considered American soft, he knew otherwise. "It is a mistake to regard Americans as luxury loving and weak," he told former classmates at a reunion in September 1941. "I can tell you that they are full of spirit, adventure, fight, and justice. Their thinking is scientific and well advanced. Remember that American industry is much more developed than ours. Unlike us, they have all the oil they want. Japan cannot vanquish the United States. Therefore, we should not fight the United States." After having made this speech, he was not aware that Japan was already planning to go to war with the United States. So he was slightly tapped to draw the blueprint for Pearl Harbor. He was also the commander-in-chief of the Japanese Navy, and he was on board the Japanese battleship Yamato, which was trailing the Japanese naval elements by about 700 or so miles. So he didn't really play any active part in the battle itself, but he was the overall command of all the ships of the Japanese Navy. Now, the commander of the Japanese carriers was Admiral Chuchi Nagumo. Admiral Nagumo was tapped for it because he was a senior admiral in the Japanese Navy, and he was a battleship admiral, like a lot of the Japanese admirals were, and he was kind of rigid in his thinking. He didn't really take a whole lot of initiative because after the Americans had struck at Pearl Harbor, when Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, if you have the next slide, please. All right, there's Admiral Yamaguchi. Yamaguchi commanded 2 of the carriers in the Pearl Harbor strike force. His command was the Soryu and the Hiryu. They were 2 Japanese light carriers. We'll get to them in a few minutes. And he went to Nagumo and said, we should strike again and again and again. He really wanted to wreck the place because he realized that with all the machine shops, with the submarine base, with all of the facilities that the Americans had at their disposal, that was a valuable forward base. And this would be Japan's best chance to knock it right out of the war for at least a few months. And Nagumo says, no, 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 we've already accomplished our missions. We've sunk most of the American battleships. We've crippled their battle line. We've pretty much destroyed their air aviation. We don't know where their aircraft carriers are. We're going to get out of here. We'll go back to Japan. And that's what they did. Fortunately for the United States. So Yamaguchi, though we were on the ropes, they wanted to deliver a knockout punch. All right, so let's take a look at the ships. So starting, we have the USS Hornet. Now, the USS Hornet was probably the newest of the American carriers. She achieved immortality by launching the Doolittle Strike on April the 18th, 1942, where she came within with about 600 miles of the Japanese mainland, and then told Jimmy Doolittle, start your engines because the Japanese have spotted us. We're going to launch your airplanes. You've got the range. You can accomplish your mission. Although you might not make the Chinese mainland and turn your bombers over to Chiang Kai-shek, you've got to go now because if the Japanese come looking for our aircraft carriers, there's just 2 of us. There's too many Japanese ships out there. We're going to strike now, and then we're going to skedaddle. So the Hornet was part of Task Force 16. Her pilots were probably the least experienced of any because the other 2 ships, the Yorktown and the Enterprise, had participated in a lot of preliminary strikes against Japanese bases in the Central Pacific. And the Yorktown had also struck at Japanese landing forces at the northern shore of New Guinea. And they also struck at Tulagi, which was just across the harbor from Guadalcanal, which we'll find out a little bit further down the line if we continue this series. So here's the Hornet. The Hornet had been there at present at Coral Sea. I'm sorry. Let's flip back to the Yorktown. All right. The Yorktown had been at Coral Sea, and her aircraft assisted in the destruction of the Japanese carrier Shoho. And then on the next day of the battle, when the Japanese started launching their own attacks at Yorktown, she was hit by a bomb. Well, the United States didn't take it lying down. They made her air group pay for that bomb hit with her defending fighters shooting down most of the Japanese aircraft which had attacked her. So she took the hit of a bomb which landed right close to the island. You can see where the smoke's coming from, and that's about where she was hit at the Coral Sea. So the Yorktown limped back to Pearl Harbor. They said she was trailed by an oil slick about 10 miles long. And from the early part of May until the 26th of May, when she finally pulled it into Pearl Harbor, she was a hurting ship. So when she came into Pearl Harbor, Chester Nimitz went down to talk to Captain Buckmaster and talk to the commander of the repair facilities. And he said in no uncertain terms, I need this aircraft carrier. I have got to have her in 3 days. I know what the experts say. The experts say it's going to take 3 months to put her back in fighting trim. I said, we don't have 3 months. We've got a week. In a week, the Japanese plan to attack Midway. So you've got to put her back in fighting trim. So they hauled her into the dry dock. It probably was the same dry dock where the USS Pennsylvania was when the Pearl Harbor struck. You remember the famous picture where one destroyer is sitting on her side and another one is up against her. Oil slick at the end of the dry dock. Pennsylvania's in the background. And that's where they hauled her out of the water. And so the commander of the facilities immediately mobilized his workforce. They stopped working on all the damaged ships in Pearl Harbor. They put everybody to work in Yorktown to try to get her back in fighting shape so that she could go out and meet the Japanese. So on the 29th of May, as per Newman's request, they flooded the dry dock. They refloated her. And she went out in the Pacific. And then the last, and probably one of the most important ships of the United States Navy in all of 1942 was the USS Enterprise. The Enterprise did terrible damage to the Japanese Navy there. And then when she went to Guadalcanal, she also decimated their air groups. She also assisted in sinking a battleship, a couple cruisers. Her air group was well trained. They were veterans aboard the ship. So the Enterprise shipped a fighter squadron, VF-6, V meaning Fighter Squadron 6, VT-6, Torpedo Squadron 6, VB-6, which was Bombing Squadron 6, and VS-6, Scouting Squadron 6. So she shipped about 780 airplanes when she left for Point Luck, which was a point out in the Pacific Ocean. So what Nimitz wanted to do was, he knew that the Japanese were coming. This was thanks to the work of the code breakers. If you were lucky enough to go to our speaker series a couple years ago, we had somebody come and talk about how the Americans had broken the Japanese code. They knew where they were going to be. They knew when they were going to be here. So they pretty much decided to set up an ambush. So the USS Enterprise and the Hornet were grouped in Task Force 16 under Spruance. And then Frank Jack Fletcher had command of the Yorktown, and they all went out to a point that the United States Navy referred to as Point Luck. So the United States Navy was very hopeful that Point Luck would be lucky for them. We'll see how lucky they were when we get there. All right. All right, here's one of the Japanese aircraft carriers. If you want an idea what she looked like in color, I've got a little model kit. This is the Akagi. You can see a couple of Japanese airplanes flying over the top of it. She was distracted by the funnel, which is coming off the port side of the ship. She was also kind of unique because the island was on the starboard side. You can't see it in this photo. All right, thank you, Rick. And that was how you took it, that was how you told it apart from the other Japanese aircraft carriers. The Akagi was modified from a Japanese battleship because, as I said, the Washington Naval Treaty said, all right, we're going to try to cut back on armaments. We don't need them. Germany's been defeated. We're not going to need you to go and fight a big fleet action with them. So the Japanese scratched their heads. They said, what are we going to do with all these hulls? Because they were planning to make more battleships and more battle cruisers so that they could fight the Germans on more even terms. So we said, okay, well, if we can't build a battleship, maybe we can make it into an aircraft carrier. All right, so if you take all right, here's the Kaga, and the Akagi was laid out pretty much the same way. You can see the 3 flight decks there. You could launch airplanes from all 3 of those flight decks, but the main flight deck being the one up the top in the traditional place. But if you needed to launch airplanes in a hurry, you could launch them out of the hangar deck, but I don't know if anybody ever really tried to do that in combat because it might be a little bit tough in rough seas, because if you run your tail into the overhead, that kind of defeats the whole purpose of having an airplane. Okay, having said that, the Kaga and the Akagi both went back to the shipyards and they built the flight decks all the way out to the length of the ship. The Kaga was a converted battle cruiser. Once again, the Japanese having no need for the battle cruisers, they weren't fast carriers, so the ships could do 32 knots. That filled they filled the bill ideally. You'll have to excuse me. I have the stroke to thank for that, but I'll muddle through somehow. Okay, the Kaga was a little bit larger than the Akagi, and they carried about 30 torpedo planes. Additionally, they had about 24 H fighters and dive bombers aboard that ship as well. The Akagi and the Kaga were the key component parts of Carrier Division 1, or Cardiv 1 for short. These were the ships that had visited Pearl Harbor on December 7th and pretty much destroyed the American fleet. All right, now having examined those two, let us move on to the Soryu. I've heard it referred to as the Green Dragon in Morrison, who was chief foremost author of the history of United States naval operations in World War II. And the Soryu was kind of a light / medium aircraft carrier. They shipped about 63 airplanes, and the Soryu and the Hiryu. The Hiryu made up Carrier Division 2, and they were under the command of Admiral Yamaguchi. Yamaguchi being the admiral who wanted to go back and really work over Pearl Harbor until they. Okay.
But they all were landing the planes.
All right, the Chikuma was a Japanese heavy cruiser. Well, what the navies would do in World War II, they would lump together ships in what they would call a task force in the United States Navy. So they take one of these and a couple of these. So for the main Midway battle force, they took the Chikuma. They were one of the newest Japanese cruisers. You'll see it in an awful lot of guns on the forepart of the ship. There were eight inchers up there. On the after end of the ship, which you cannot see, was a flying off platform with a couple of catapults. And it was essentially a hangar deck. And the Chikuma could carry as many as 5 to 8 cruiser float planes. And the cruiser float planes would act as the scouting planes for the Imperial Japanese Navy. So if they thought they were near American ships, they would launch the scouts out, see if they could find out, ascertain exactly what the American force was composed of. So the task force for the Kaido Butai, which stood for striking force, that was Japanese for task force. They also was built around 2 battleships, and those battleships were also built during World War I. They were extremely fast for battleships. Most battleships could only do about 21 or 23 knots, 25, depending on whose battleships they were. But they were fast enough so they could tactically combine with the aircraft carriers and provide anti-aircraft support, as well as reconnaissance support as well. So the Chikuma went, because I've already said that she's providing scouting, but she could also use her anti-aircraft guns as a floating battery to knock down any attacking aircraft. In addition to that, there were about 8 destroyers that went with the aircraft carriers. They generally assigned 2 destroyers per aircraft carrier, one to act as a scout, the other to act as a plane guard, just in case somebody happened to ditch in the water. It was a lot easier to pick them up with a destroyer than it was to try to stop an aircraft carrier and retrieve them. So the Kaido Butai had 4 carriers, 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers. There was also the light cruiser, the Nagara. It looked like a throwback to World War I. It was very obsolete looking compared to this nice modern ship, the Chikuma. And then in addition to that, there were 4 world class. The Japanese destroyers were amazingly advanced for their time. They generally carried about 5 or 6 5-inch anti-aircraft type guns. They also had torpedo nests arrayed along the center line of the ship, and they could have as many as 3 or 4 torpedo tubes in each one of those banks. And the Japanese torpedoes were absolutely phenomenal. You would find out how deadly they were when the United States Navy got to Guadalcanal. We can talk about that down the line. But we won't talk about that tonight because we've got a lot of ground to cover and it's got nothing to do with what we're talking about here. Thank you very much. All right, here are the airplanes. And so let's take a look at the Japanese Zero. Now, the Japanese Zero was an amazing airplane.
I've heard of
It was designed starting in the 1930s. And from 1930s, when they first started to lay out the design for the airplane, when Yamamoto, who was the chief of aircraft development, about the time the Zero was designed, he went to Jiro Horikoshi, who was the chief designer at Mitsubishi, and he handed him, here's a list of specifications for this airplane. We want this airplane to do, we want this airplane to do that. And Jiro, knowing what's coming off his drawing boards and what's coming off everybody else's drawing boards, he said, "You have got to be kidding me." And he said, all right, Yamamoto said, "Okay, if you can't do it, I'll go talk to Nakajima or Kawasaki or somebody. I'll find somebody who can design me this airplane." So he said, "Okay, boss, you're calling the shots." So he went back. And this is the airplane he came up with. If you look at the wings, you'll see 2 20mm cannon. And on that black cowling in front of the cockpit, you could see a couple slots where 2 7.7mm rifle caliber machine guns were mounted. These airplanes, he pretty much did exactly what Yamamoto wanted him to do. The airplanes were amazingly maneuverable. They were faster than anybody else's frontline airplanes at the time. And the range was phenomenal. They could fly at least 1,000 miles without refueling. Nobody else had an airplane that could do that. And unfortunately, if you're going to do all that, you're going to pay a price for it. And the price that the Japanese paid, there was no radio equipment on most of the airplanes because that was a weight penalty they didn't want to pay. There were no self-sealing fuel tanks for a simple reason. That was more of a weight penalty. And in addition to that, there was no armor plate to protect anything inside the airplane. So usually if the Japanese designed this airplane with the idea they were going to be calling most of the shots, being the aggressor most of the shots when these airplanes went into combat. So consequently, they were extremely vulnerable to attack by enemy aircraft. Okay, the B-5N Kate. Well, these were your chief assassins at Midway. This one's painted up to look like the lead ship at Midway. That was Mitsuo Fuchida at Midway. And he was kind of master of ceremonies. He got there first and he directed everybody and told them where to hit. And most of these guys had the orders already, so they pretty much knew where to go and what they wanted to do. You can see that Japanese torpedo, it was about a 1,200-pound torpedo. Of course, not all of that was warhead. Most of it was also fuel and propellant. And they were extremely reliable. It was these airplanes that destroyed the U.S. Navy's battle line, capsized the Oklahoma, sank West Virginia, sank the California, put a torpedo into the Arizona, USS Raleigh, the Utah. Well, you get the idea. They were good. They were flown by crack pilots who had been in combat flying against the Chinese since about the 1930s. So that's where most of these cut their teeth. And most of the Japanese aviators were very experienced and they knew their job. They were good at it. All right, so there were 3 general types that flew off the aircraft carriers. And the third type on the Japanese was the Aichi D3A Val. The Val was a dive bomber. The dive bomber was kind of an American invention because there was an American pilot by the name of Al Williams and he was doing a demonstration in an air show. And he'd be dropping flour sacks or something, and he'd have to be pretty much hitting right near the target. There must have been an observer from the Japanese, and there was also some observers from the Germans, and they thought, hey, that's pretty cool. We want some of those too. We want airplanes that can do that, knock out precision targets. So the result of the Germans was the Stuka. The result of the Japanese was the Val. And the Val was an extremely effective aircraft. The Japanese turned 81 of them loose on 2 British cruisers in the Indian Ocean. The result was they made short work of the HMS Cornwall and the HMS Dorsetshire, of the 81 planes that attacked. And the pilots reported back that they had scored about 81% hits. So that meant for every 5 bombs that was dropped, 4 of them hit the target. I think maybe a lot of them just splashed water on the target, but you get the idea. They were good. And probably the best dive bomber squadron in the Japanese Navy was flying off the Hiryu. And we'll see what they do later in the battle. All right. All right, local boy makes good. So you can see a Martin B-26 Marauder. They were actually designed as a medium bomber, which would fly within about 10,000 to 11,000 feet and bomb targets from that altitude using the famous Norden bomb sight. And you can say, well, Chuck, the airplanes can't drop a torpedo at 11,000 feet and do any damage to a ship. And you're absolutely correct. So they were trying to train some bomber pilots who flew the Marauders to drop torpedoes on the Japanese Navy. Nothing beats a try but a failure. But the Martins were of the original production block. You can see that tail number. It's 1373, which means he was one of the original 200 B-26s ordered by the Army Air Force right off the drawing board before they even cut a piece of metal, before they even flown it. They just thought, this is the airplane that we want. This is a world beater. So there she is. There were 4 Martin B-26 at the island of Midway. We'll see how they did when we get to that point. All right, moving along. The B-17, they were kind of the Americans' experiment to prove that Julio Duhay, who was a prophet for air warfare, who said the bomber would always get through. The idea of making the airplane as strong as they could and putting as many defensive positions on the airplane as they could. If you'll notice, there is a turret right up behind the cockpit. If you look behind the trailing edge of the wing, you can see a couple machine guns in the belly turret. All right, that's the waist window. All right, drop down. There you go. That's the belly turret. That was a ball turret. The guy would be in there. They'd be all scrunched up from the time the airplane took off until the time he came out. And then they'd get him out of there if he had to abandon ship. All right, and then in the tail, we've got the Stinger, which protected one of the most vulnerable parts of the airplane. So in case somebody came up behind the airplane, there would be somebody to defend it, to keep somebody from sitting on the tail and chewing up the whole airplane from that position. So the B-17s were also present at Midway. They would fly out great distances from some of the planes that bombed the Japanese ships actually came from the island of Maui, which is east of Oahu, the main island of the Hawaiian Islands. All right, then let's see what we got here. All right, here are the PBY Catalinas. The Catalinas were based in the lagoon at Midway. And it was the purpose of the Catalinas to go out far in advance, far away from the island of Midway. In fact, it was a Catalina, or CAT for short, flying about 700 miles out from Midway into the southwest. They happened to locate some of the Japanese ships which were coming to invade Midway. So there were transports, there were the fleet train that would repair ships, an oiler, all the ships that they would need to sustain a protracted campaign against the island. And so this was this PBY that was flying out of Midway, and it just nudges his co-pilot and says, hey, there's the whole Jap Navy down there. And there were about 70 ships or so. There were battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. And they were all headed for Midway. So he called it in, and the commander of the island of Midway told his commander of the bombers, all right, bomb them up. We're going out to see if we can do any damage against them. All right, in addition to the bombers, there were also fighters, because you needed something to defend the island of Midway. So probably the most numerous fighter on Midway were the Brewster F-2A Buffaloes. They were under command of Major Parks. The idea was that the Brewster would go out and they would defend the island against any Japanese aircraft that attacked. And unfortunately for the pilots of the Brewster Buffalo, we'll get to that part when we actually get to the actual Battle of Midway, but unfortunately, they weren't up to the job of fighting the Japanese Zeros. Okay, there's a head-on shot. They were made at aircraft company Brewster. They were up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Nobody really had a whole lot of success with them except the Finns when they were fighting the Russians. They were very successful. Some of their pilots made ace while they were flying these airplanes. To the best of my knowledge, there is only one left in the world, and that goes from place to place. I think it might be in Finland now. The only reason they had that was we was shot down by the Russians. It was found in a lake. They pulled it out, and that's what she looked like. Okay, in defense of Midway, we also have the Grumman F-4F Wildcat. The F stands for fighter. It was the fourth Grumman aircraft that was accepted by the Navy. And then the F also stood for, it was made from the Grumman Aircraft Factory. So it was a fighter, the fourth fighter, it was from Grumman, and they called the airplane the Wildcat. Now the Americans got a little bit of advantage with the Wildcats because the Wildcats just started to come off the assembly line, and just before the Battle of Midway, there were enough Wildcats at Midway so they could re-equip all three of the squadrons from the three carriers with Wildcats with folding wings. So you can see where the wings broke. They'd fold the wings, they'd lock the wings in place, or they'd unlock the wings and they'd fold them. So what does this mean? Well, for an aircraft carrier, you've got to realize there's not a whole lot of space. The folding wings allowed the American carriers to take about half again as many Wildcats with the folding wings as they could ship with Wildcats with no folding wings. Okay, there's a picture of one on the ground. They had 6 50 caliber machine guns for armament. And the Navy wasn't real happy about the F-4Fs. They said they're not as good as the F-3Fs. So they said, well, what's wrong with them? He said, well, for one thing, the machine guns. What's wrong with the machine guns? He said, well, they only have about 420 rounds per gun. The old ones had about 500 rounds per gun. Why did you reduce the amount of machine gun bullets? They said, well, we're just responding to a British specification. Of course, the American pilots threw up their hands because that's what they had. When it's there, that's what you use. So they weren't real happy with the Wildcats, but they would gradually exonerate themselves in the course of the war. Okay, here's another product of the Grumman factory. You remember I said that's what the S stands for, Grumman. T stands for torpedo, B stands for bomber. So the American great step forward. You remember, if you can think back to the picture of the Japanese B-5N torpedo plane, you saw the torpedo or the B-26 Marauder, the torpedo hung to the bottom of the airplane. And right here, in the belly of the airplane, it was about a 19-foot bomb bay, which was big enough to hold an American torpedo plane. So with the torpedo tucked in the belly of the airplane, the plane was much more streamlined. You weren't paying a penalty of drag as the hole in that. Thank you, Rick. There's a bomb bay right there. And as a result of the bomb bay, they could carry the torpedoes internally. You streamline it, you weren't paying that much of a penalty of drag. There was no drag. The airplane was streamlined. Right, if you look up here, you can see, let's look at the second Wildcat. Let me turn it back to that one, if you would, please. All right, and if you look at the second one, you see the wing folded sideways. That's the way the wing folded up on the Wildcat as well. And enabled the airplanes to really fit much more compactly on an aircraft carrier. The aircraft carrier could hold more planes because the wings folded up. And it was great economy space. All right, now this airplane is really interesting. And the reason I say that it's interesting, if you notice the number is 8T1 on the side of the fuselage. The 8 means it was VT8, which is Torpedo Squadron 8, T standing for torpedo planes, and 1, it was the first plane of the squadron. This was the first Grumman Avenger to come off the assembly line at the factory in Long Island, New York. And it was also present at the Battle of Midway. All right, and there she is, AT-1. And you've heard it say any landing you can walk away from is a good one. And a good landing, you can reuse the airplane. Unfortunately, she was so badly shot up, she was pretty much scrapped right where she sat. And unfortunately, there were 6 Avengers at the Battle of Midway, and we'll see what they did a little bit further when we get into the actual battle. All right, and the Japanese had the 0 for the fighter. They had the Kate for the dive bomber. And they had the Kate for the torpedo plane, and the Dauntless as a dive bomber. So if you look real closely, you can see a bomb slung underneath the center of the airplane. That right there, that's good. That was generally a 500-pounder. And if it was scouting squadron, she'd carry a 500-pounder. If it was bombing squadron, they generally hung a 1,000-pounder underneath of that one. And the smaller bomb, just rear of that, would be about 100-pound bombs. They could also do some anti-personnel damage with those, but the big ship busters were the 500-pounders and the 1,000-pound bombs. And there's a rather interesting story that's going to come up with the Battle of Midway as we get a little bit closer to that. So you see on the side, there's 6 S-14, which meant that was the 6 being Scouting 6, the S being Scouting Squadron, 14th, it was the 14th airplane to the squadron. And if you look just below the lower aircraft, you can see an aircraft carrier. There's in all probability that's the Enterprise, and these planes are probably coming back from the attack on the Japanese ships. And they're some of the lucky ones because they're still in the air and they don't look like they're really badly damaged. So looks like they pretty much avoided getting cut up by the Japanese. So we'll get into that when we talk about the battle. All right, so we've already talked about the Avenger. The other torpedo plane the Americans had was the Devastator. It was a Douglas Devastator. And but the only claim to fame that she had, she flew low and slow. And she had to fly low to drop the torpedo without breaking it up. If you dropped it too high, it would break up when it entered the water. If you dropped it too low, it might splash on your airplane and knock you out of the sky. You can see how they hung. They really weren't very streamlined. They were on the belly of the airplane, so they hung down there. The E on the side of the airplane was an efficiency award, which meant that the pilot was pretty good. And 5T7 means it was the 5th Torpedo Squadron's, T for torpedo. It was the 7th airplane in the squadron. She would be flying off of the USS Yorktown, and at the Battle of Midway, the Yorktown had 14 of them, which she launched at the Japanese ships. Okay, here's another one. It's probably 6T2, which means it was probably off of the USS Enterprise. It was the 6th Torpedo Squadron, and that was probably the executive officer's airplane. And she looks like she's returning to the aircraft carrier. She'll land aboard, and then they'll get her ready for the next mission. All right, now let's get on to the battle. All right, let's put our thinking caps on before we get too far into this. We've got the Northern Force, and one of the reasons the Japanese were going to try to capture Midway, because the Midway was going to be an outpost of the Japanese Empire. So you see Midway there, you see Wake Island down here. They would tie scouting planes flying between the Aleutians into Midway and into Wake Island, and they used kind of a tripwire. So anytime American ships tried to penetrate that wire, the Japanese would know they were coming, so they could mobilize their fleet, come out, and frustrate any advances the Americans tried to make to penetrate the Japanese defensive perimeter. So that's why. Then Admiral Kondo, who was another battleship admiral, he was coming out of the Carolines. And these were the ones that were first seen by the American PBY on June the 3rd. But the ones we're most interested in is the one right in the center of the first carrying strike force, the Kaido Butai. That was the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. They were frontline carriers. They'd all been present at the Battle of Midway. The Kaido Butai was kind of disgusted at the other 2 aircraft carriers that had been at Midway. That was the Shokaku and the Shuikaku. And the reason why they were disgusted at them, because the Americans had beaten them and they were incapable of fulfilling their mission. So they decided, okay, we're going to show these guys how it's done. So they set sail for Midway, and they were confident that they would win over the American ships. Okay, so we have, let's imagine now, it's 4:30 in the morning. You're up on the island of the Akagi, and you're looking over the flight deck. And you're watching about 30-some airplanes running their engines. They were all turning over at once. There's a terrible roar coming from the flight deck as the airplane sat there. And then the Japanese were kind of lucky. As they approached the Midway they were coming on, of course, it would allow them to launch their airplanes by sailing directly into the wind. They would be constantly closing with Midway because they had the wind to help coming over the flight deck to give them, creating extra lift for the airplanes, reducing the takeoff run. So one by one, watch them launch. There's an officer in a white uniform down there waving a white flag. And the pilot's peering off the side of the canopy. The Japanese Zero, he sees the officer. The officer waves him off, and another, until within about the next 5 minutes or so, the Japanese were very efficient launching their airplanes. There are 108 airplanes on their way to Midway. So they all formed up, and they're behind a torpedo bomber, and it was being flown by Lieutenant Tominaga. Tominaga, he was the master of ceremonies, as it were. The Japanese ships were the air groups are kind of unusual, where the Americans were usually commanded by a lieutenant commander. Usually it was either a lieutenant commander or a first lieutenant who would command the Japanese air groups, and he would be the one to coordinate the strike on the enemy targets. All right, so about an hour after they took off, they're on their way to Midway, and the Americans had a pretty good idea where and when they were coming, so they had these big Catalinas out there looking for them. This is the 11th Patrol Squadron, P, and it's the 9th Aircraft Patrol Squadron. So there were about 12 Catalinas at Midway at the time, and this one just happened to spot the Japanese coming. And of course, he was glad there was a little bit of cloudy day, because if the Japanese would have seen him, they might have peeled off a few fighters to go out to knock this airplane down because this was doing what it's supposed to do, go out and find the Japanese. So the radio operator gets on the radio and he notifies the island of Midway. Many planes heading Midway at such and such a course. And unfortunately, he did not give a position for the aircraft. So, all right, really good. All right, where are they coming from? Who knows? So the defenders, Parks has his orders, pilots man your planes. So the 18 Buffaloes and the 5 Wildcats take off to try to intercept the Japanese force. So maybe around, of course, while this is going on, the Americans say, all right, the Japanese are coming, they're out there somewhere, we'll just fly a reciprocal course. So off went the Avengers, off went the B-26s, and off went the B-17s to try to find the Japanese ships to see if they could damage some before they could do any serious damage to Midway. So here's one of your B-17s again. They carry maybe a dozen bomb or so 500 pounders, depending upon how they were hung. And the idea was to, of course, the Americans had tremendous faith in the ability of the Norden bomb sight, because the Norden bomb sight was allegedly could put a bomb in a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. And everybody kind of scratched their heads and said, really? Well, let's see. So, of course, that presupposes the
pickle barrel sitting still. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So as a result of that, the Japanese aircraft carriers were free to maneuver. So we'll see if we got any strike photos. There we go. It looks like the Akagi right there. And she's describing a perfect circle. And it says later in one of Morrison's books, he put the caption underneath of it, the Akagi's perfect circle will not save her. So okay, there's another pattern. One of the lighter carriers. Let's see it might be to hear you. You can see the pattern, and the intervalometer determines when each bomb will fall. And of course, the Japanese skipper, he knows, well, if I stay in a straight line, I might get hit by one of these things, so I better take evasive action. So far, the B-17s went out, and they had no success in hitting any of the Japanese. So if you're in baseball, no hits, no runs, no errors. They went back to reload and come back later. So right around 7 o'clock, the Americans finally got lucky. They found the Japanese aircraft carriers. Now, this incident actually happened. That is a Martin B-26. The Martin got as close as it could. It dropped its torpedo. And I guess the pilot figured probably the safest place in the world right now is over top of the aircraft carrier. The Japanese fighters won't shoot at me because they might hit some of its own people. So he tried to make good his escape. And the pilot's name of one of those was Lieutenant Miri. And Miri, I guarantee you, he had his hands full because the Japanese had about 20 fighters out there right now. And their only job was to make sure those airplanes either failed to launch their torpedoes, or B, did not hit anything, or C, shoot them into the ocean. The 2-engine layout probably saved these airplanes because 2 of the Marauders actually did manage to escape the Japanese defending fighters and return to Midway. In addition to that, of the 6 Avengers which took off, there was only 1 survivor, and you saw the picture of what she looked like when she got back to Midway. So unfortunately, the Americans weren't really doing very well at this stage of the battle. So about 7 o'clock in the morning, the Americans are preparing their own strike force. There is a strike force coming for the Enterprise. You can see the Dauntlesses in the foreground. Immediately behind the Dauntless, there are torpedo Devastators. And you've got Devastators stretched out from there to the rear of the ship. And they're getting ready to launch everybody. to go out and find the Japanese ships. This must have been some sort of training mission because only one of them actually has any weaponry on board. The torpedoes are not rigged on these airplanes, but that's what the launch would look like aboard the carriers. The wings on it devastate. Okay, there's an Avenger launching a torpedo, and this is what happened about 7 o'clock in the morning. And unfortunately, if any of the Avengers got close enough to the Japanese carriers to drop a torpedo, unfortunately, they didn't hit anything. And the Japanese were able to outrun the torpedoes or outmaneuver the torpedoes. And once again, there were no hits on the Japanese ships. So as the Japanese got to the island of Midway, the Americans had the 23 fighters out to intercept them. And unfortunately, the Japanese, led by the Japanese Zeros, pretty much brushed the Brewster Buffaloes out of the way. They shot down 13, and the other 5 they pretty much crippled. And then there were 7 Wildcats. 2 of them only landed. One of them was being flown by Marion Carl, who was a Marine ace. He would achieve fame in Guadalcanal in the campaign there. His airplane was still usable, but all they had after that first Japanese strike, the Japanese had succeeded in shooting down the bulk of the Japanese aircraft, which were based on Midway Island. And so, well, they said, okay, rearm it, put gas in it. They come back, I'll go back up. And while this is going on, the Japanese are striking. They're using their valves and they're using their Kates. The Kates have got anti-personnel bombs, fragmentary bombs, to destroy as many troops as they can, destroy as many installations and guns which are defending the island of Midway as they can. So they work the place over. So this attack went on for about a half an hour or so. So eventually Tominaga pulls away from the island. He kind of circles around. He's looking back and he sees all the flak that's still coming up. So he commands his charge to return to the Japanese ships. So they begin to make their way back, and he's still surveying the scene. So he calls on the radio, there is need for a second attack. So the Japanese said, okay, we got to go back and do it again. All right, well, we can do that. So now the Japanese start to run into some problems. And the first problem is the fact that they had scout planes out flying from the cruisers. The Tona and the Chikuma launched scout planes. The Haruna, a battleship, launched a scout plane as well. They all had sectors to search, and one of the Tona Float Zero, actually, wasn't a Float Zero, it was called a Jake. One of the Jakes actually spotted ships. So he radios back. He says there are 5 Japanese carriers. I'm sorry, there are 5 destroyers and 5 cruisers. So he must have spotted the escort. He must have spotted the escort for Task Force 16. So all of a sudden, Nagumo looks at Admiral Kusaka, who's his number 2, and there are ships out there. What are the ships doing out there? We didn't expect the Americans to show up at least for another day. According to the plan, that's the way it was supposed to work. How did they know? So what are we going to do? So Admiral Tominaga, aboard the Soryu and the Hiryu, says, all right, I've got 36 dive bombers ready to go. Launch me. He said, no, we can't do that yet. If we're going to fly, we're going to attack the American ships, we're going to send a whole air group. So all of a sudden, we've got all these carrier planes that are all set to go and attack the island of Midway, but they're armed with anti-personnel bombs. You can't use them very well against ships. You need something, a bunch of holes in the flight decks. And you also need some torpedoes to deal with the hulls, to see if they can slow them down. So there's great consternation aboard the Japanese flagship. So he says, okay, prepare these airplanes for an anti-ship strike. So they break the spot, which means all the airplanes were sitting on the flight deck immediately go below decks. And they start exchanging the bombs for torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, and then replacing them on the flight deck. So in the meantime, the Japanese have got to be careful because A, they've got fighters up that are intercepting the American planes. So they're constantly doing some sort of a dance because you've got combat air patrol landing. You've got strike airplanes landing. And you really don't have a whole lot of runway to deal with all these airplanes. So all these air officers are really pulling their hair out and they're trying to figure out how the best way to get this airplanes ready for the strike, which the admiral wants. And so they go to work with a will. Of course, we're not quite ready for the dive bombers yet, but we'll get to them. Is a suspense building? Okay. You have the Americans not being idle at this time at 0700. They start to launch their airplanes. So the Hornet launches about 35 dive bombers. They launch 10 fighters. They launch 20 fighters, 10 to actually protect the ship from Japanese attack, and the other 10 to accompany the dive bombers and the 15 torpedo bombers, which they launch. In addition to that, the Enterprise starts to launch their attack as well. So the Enterprise sends out about 35 dive bombers, scouting 6 and bombing 6, each one of them armed with either a 500 or 1,000-pound bomb, depending upon which squadron they're connected to. They also launch 6 fighter planes to fly an escort for that. And in addition to that, they launch 12 torpedo planes. Okay, the Yorktown's kind of lagging behind now because they sent out some scouting planes earlier in the morning to make sure there weren't any Japanese coming in from the northwest sector, which was where they were supposed to show up from. And unfortunately, they took a little bit different course and they weren't there. So Yorktown launches their combat air patrol as well. And then he prepared to take aboard the scouting planes, which are going out looking for the Japanese ships. So she was a little late getting her air group off. So it wouldn't be about 9 o'clock in the morning before they finally Yorktown managed to launch all of her aircraft. So in the meantime, you have the Japanese frantically preparing to get their airplanes ready to strike at the American ships. Then about 9 o'clock in the morning, the torpedo planes from USS Hornet are just droning along over the Pacific Ocean. All right, they don't see anything, and all of a sudden, then the commander of the torpedo bombers, John Waldron, decides, I know where the Japanese are. He said, the commander of the air group, he doesn't have a clue, so he can go where he wants to go. I'm going to find the Japanese carriers. So he immediately breaks off from the main strike force and assumes a course which is going to take him exactly to where the Japanese were. So he's flying over the Pacific, and then gradually he happens to look out of his window and there's smoke on the horizon. Aha, Japanese ships. So he contacts the rest of the squadron and he says, follow me. And sure enough, Waldron didn't know where the Japanese were. Unfortunately, when he broke off from the bombers and the escorting fighters, he kind of left his support group behind him. So Yorktown, or the Hornets aircraft decided they were going to get on the course the Japanese ships were expected to take if they were going to continue on to Midway. And so, unfortunately, they proceeded to indulge in what they called the flight that went nowhere. So he turned toward Midway, and during the battle, the dive bombers played no active part in the activities of the morning. So in the meantime, here comes Waldron. He's starting to gain on the Japanese ships. I mean, they can only move along at 30 knots, and I mean, at least 100 miles an hour. Eventually, they're going to catch up with them. So look at, support the Chikuma, spot the American airplane. So they They swing those eight inchers to the side in the general direction of the approaching airplanes, and begins to commence firing. So in the path of the American torpedo planes, great water spouts start to spring up as these shells hit. The idea being, if they can persuade one of those American torpedo planes to fly into one of those spouts, it'll knock it right out of the sky. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, but unfortunately, it really didn't have to, for the simple reason the Japanese had all of these fighters up in the air. And the Devastators are coming in at about 100 miles an hour. The Japanese Zeros are at least twice as fast as those airplanes. And it's kind of wolves hunting deer, one by one. They knocked the first plane into the water. John Waldron hears about this. The guy trailing the formation, he reports the loss of that airplane. Then he reports the loss of two more. And gradually, as they get closer to the aircraft carriers, somebody pulls up behind Waldron's airplane and they immediately proceed to pump shells into his airplane. So his airplane's on the way down. So George Gay is in, he's probably the youngest member of the squadron. He's the most inexperienced, and everybody used to make fun of him and said, George, you couldn't hit the broadside of a barn door. He said, I'm going in, I'm going to make it, I'll get a hit. Unfortunately for George, the Japanese had other ideas. They shot down his airplane as well. So as a result of 15 airplanes which started the attack, they had all been shot into the Pacific. And George Gay was the only survivor. He scrambled out of the airplane and grabbed a seat cushion and then jumped into the water holding the seat cushion. Of course, the Japanese saw him do that, so they came down with their airplanes. They tried to shoot him and kill him as he was helpless in the water. Of course, the battle was moving away from them, so they lost interest. And there he was out in the Pacific all by himself. Nothing to hold him to keep him from sinking was his seat cushion. Right. In the meantime, you had the B-17 showing up and bombing the Japanese ships, all unsuccessfully. So they went back for another load to have another go at it. So at about 09:30 in the morning, you have the torpedo bombers from the Enterprise show up. This is Torpedo 8. This is commanded by Lieutenant Commander Gene Lindsay. It was kind of odd that he was actually flying the mission, because a couple days before the Battle of Midway, he had crashed his airplane into the water. And it was all banged up. So he went to the captain. The captain says, Gene, are you going to fly this mission? He says, yes, sir. That's what I've trained. That's what I'm here for. I'm going to lead my men. So he got into his airplane and they found the Japanese ships. They started their pursuit. So they gradually started to overtake them. And of course, the Japanese aircraft came down as well. And of course, the American the Wildcats were there. Unfortunately, they did not know that they knew the Wildcats were there. They did not know that the Devastators were going into the attack. As a result, they were orbiting at about 18,000 feet, just waiting for somebody to say, hey, Jim, come on down. And of course, Jim was just circling round and round and round and boring holes in the sky. And one after another, the Japanese fighters came in and proceeded to shoot 10 of the 12 Devastators into the water. So by now, you've had 2 of the air groups of the U.S. carriers attack to no effect. And all they succeeded in doing is lose all but 2 of the airplanes. So at 9:50, the Fighting Six says, well, there's nothing for us to do. And we've got Wildcats. They don't have the range that the Zeros have. We're kind of running low on fuel. I guess we better go home because they might need us around the aircraft carriers. The Japanese launch a counterstrike. So they left. And a few minutes later, the Suryu had spotted those airplanes, so they figured, well, there's still plenty of airplanes. We'll throw up a few, we'll launch about 3 more fighters. So off they went. So now, about the same time that these additional, by this time, the Japanese have about 41 Zero fighters in the air around the carriers. Needless to say, the Americans are kind of overmatched. About this time, the Yorktown torpedo planes show up, and there are 14 torpedo planes. So they went in as well. And of course, their fighters didn't have any idea where they were, so they attacked. The Japanese hacked another 4 airplanes out of the air. And as a result, 5 of them managed to limp out of the battle. One of them was so badly damaged it would never get back to the Yorktown. But the other 4 exited the area and tried to make their way back to the carriers as best they could. So it's about 10:20 in the morning. And we haven't forgotten about the Enterprise dive bombers. The Enterprise dive bombers went where they thought the Japanese were going to be. They didn't turn up there, so they instituted what they call a box search. So as they're flying kind of southwest, they make a 90-degree turn to the right, and they fly a little way along a little ways, and then they try. All right, let's try this course. So they turned again at 90 degrees, and this puts them on a northeasterly heading. So commanding the American Air Group was Wade McCluskey. Wade McCluskey was a former fighter pilot. He took command of the entire air group, so it was his job to lead these dive bombers. Being a fighter pilot, he's not really used to being a dive bomber. He probably never dropped a bomb as a dive bomber pilot. So as a result, they're flying along, and they gradually, maybe about 9:25 or so, he happens to look down, and there is the Japanese destroyer hightailing it in the northeast direction. They're going the same direction he is. And they figure, well, maybe he's late for lunch or something. So they think, well, if he's going for the main Kaido Butai, if I follow this course, maybe I'll find him. So he goes along, and gradually he spots the smoke too. And so he calls his other squadron leader, Dick Best, who's in command of Bombing 6, and we decide, all right, we're going for the first aircraft carrier that we see. So they get closer and closer and closer. So one of the things that's going on while these guys are getting closer to the Japanese, you have some fighters that are flying off one of the ships commanded by Jimmy Thatch. And Jimmy Thatch was in his kitchen one day. He was playing with some matchsticks. He says, you got 2 here, you got 2 here. So what I'm going to do, we're going to try to maneuver on the Japanese. So he called it the Thatch Weave after himself. The Thatch Weave was supposed to work. The lead ship, we call the second part of the formation. They didn't know what happened to the other pilot. He was apparently shot down by a Japanese Zero. So this is Ram Dib, and this is Macomber. So the Zero comes up behind Dib, and he says, "Skipper, I got one on my tail. Get him off me." So Jimmy says, "All right, just turn toward me." So he gradually turned toward the 2 American planes over here, and the Japanese Zero immediately followed him. So when the Japanese airplane passed in front of Jimmy Thatch, he triggered his machine gun. And we already noted that the Japanese had saved as much weight made the airplanes as light as they possibly could. Well, what that meant was if they got hit by a concentrated burst, there was a very good chance that they would blow up, they would go down. And that's exactly what happened. So Jimmy triggered his machine guns. He scored hits all along the fuselage, and the next thing he knew, Japanese Zero was headed for the ocean. So he tried this 2 more times, and he succeeded in knocking down 2 more airplanes. So he shot down 3 airplanes in one afternoon, and they kind of cleared all the area above the Japanese carriers. There are no fighters up there. What's up there? Well, here come the Americans. So bombing 6 and scouting 6 all start to creep up on the Japanese carriers. So he goes, all right, let's all take on this big one, which turned out to be the Kaga. And then somebody realized, wait a minute, we're making a mistake here because we're only going to, all right, so the Dauntlesses were equipped with these dive brakes. And what the dive brakes did, they helped to stabilize the airplanes. They deployed from both sides of the wing. There was another flap coming down here, and they would make the dive a lot stabler and enable the pilot to get a better line on the ship. And if you got close enough, you drop your bomb, and hopefully it will, by the time it fell where the ship was, it would hit the ship. So you can see a dive bomber coming down now. He's going after the Akagi. You can tell by that big funnel on the side of the ship, and there's the bridge on the port side. And the flight deck is packed with airplanes. So the Americans could not have picked a better time to attack, because in another 5 minutes, the Japanese were planning to turn into the wind and launch their strike force at the American ships. So everything's hinging upon what happens, what these dive bombers do. So McCloskey starts to lead his airplanes down on the Akagi. And Best, and he sees what's going on, so he decides, you know, somebody. So number 1 was a bomb which splashed in the water just on the port side of the ship. And the first bomb to actually strike a Japanese warship after Pearl Harbor. Couldn't have landed in a better place. Where it hit, it penetrated back to the hangar deck. So all the aircraft on the flight deck, all the aircraft in the hangar deck started to explode in succession like firecrackers. And of course, the Japanese, having had to rearm the airplanes, they didn't bother to put the bombs that they were going to use on Midway back in the ammunition lockers. So in addition to the airplanes blowing up, all these munitions are blowing up as well. And the next thing you know, you've got a real bonfire on board the flagship of the attack force. Okay, then in addition to that, they started lining up on the Kaga as well. So these are the guys carrying the 1,000-pounders. You can see one of the bombs hit right in front of the bridge, which pretty much killed everybody on the bridge, including the captain. And of course, the airplanes on the flight deck, they started to explode as well. So the next thing you know, you've got 2 Japanese ships that are in extremis as a result of this dive bombing attack. Now, I mean, the Americans just kept on rolling 7s, one after another. All this time that's going on, then scouting 3, bombing 3 from Yorktown shows up, and they draw a bead on the Soryu. Okay, so here comes Max Leslie, and unfortunately, Max is kind of working at a disadvantage. On his way to the target, he was climbing, and he said, well, I think I'll arm my bomb. So he armed his bomb, and the next thing he knew, his airplane got a little bit later because a 1,000-pounder had just dropped from his airplane because there was a problem with the electrical system. So he just put a 1,000-pounder in the Pacific Ocean, probably killed a lot of fish, but it sure didn't go where he wanted it to go. So Max Holmberg, who's flying right behind him, calls him up on his radio and he says, "Hey, Max, you just lost your bomb." Of course, Max has one of these "oh crap" moments. So he gets on his radio and he says, "Look, don't bother to arm your bomb until you're getting close to the Japanese ships. We don't want to be losing anymore." So fortunately, by the time the Yorktown bombers found the Soryu, they had 13 planes that were still good. And Max said, "Well, I haven't flown this plane for 20 years for the Navy. I'm going to get my licks in." So he decided he would make a dive on the Soryu anyway. So when he got close, he triggered his machine guns. And of course, the rest of his air group, and Jimmy Thatch is watching this. He said it will be collecting into a silvery waterfall, just falling one after another on the Soryu. And as a result, the Soryu was on the receiving end of 3 more bombs. And as a result, there was a decade of airplanes because the Japanese were all ready to launch their airplanes at the American carriers. Unfortunately, the American strike precluded that from happening. And they pretty much mangled the flight deck and started fires and explosions on board of Soryu. Of all the ships, the Soryu would be the first one to go down. So as the Americans flew away from the Japanese ships, they left 3 funeral pyres in their wake. And they returned back to the Yorktown and they returned to the Enterprise, secure in the knowledge they had done a great amount of damage to the Japanese ships. Okay, well, there's still one carrier we haven't heard from. That's the Hiryu. And the Hiryu, the skipper was Admiral Tominaga, a very aggressive admiral. And he says, "Look, I've got to try to salvage something out of the situation." So never for the minute suspecting, well, since I've got the only intact, I'm going to launch my strike force. So he launched 6 fighters and 18 dive bombers. The dive bomber squadron from the Hiryu was probably the best in the Japanese Navy. They had a fairly high ship percentage of ships that they had hit and sunk. So they were hoping to continue that performance against the United States carriers. So at about 1040 or 1050, they finally all launched from the flight deck of the Hiryu and they go looking for the Americans. And the Americans made it kind of easy for the Japanese anyway, because their airplanes were flying back to the American ships and some of them were smoking and in bad shape. So they said, "All right, we will follow the American ships. They will take us, follow the American airplanes. They will take us right to where the American ships are." And that's exactly what they did. Okay. So it's about 12:15 in the afternoon, and all of a sudden, the fighter director officer on board the USS Yorktown, all of a sudden starts seeing blips on his radar screen. And he goes, "I don't think they're ours." So he says, "I think they're Japanese." So he calls on his combat air patrol to go out and investigate. So he tells them to fly at such and such a course to intercept the incoming Japanese airplanes. Now, radar being in its infancy, it didn't give the exact altitude of the airplane. It didn't give their airspeed either. So the best he could do was kind of guesstimate where he thought the Japanese were going to be. So he calls up the fighter planes and he says, "Okay, I've got some, and then on such and such a course, you should see the Japanese planes." So the American Wildcats went after the Japanese Val dive bombers. Art Brassfield was leading some of them. He was a fairly senior officer in the fighter group. So he happens to stumble onto the Vals and he immediately proceeds to dispatch 4 of them. So all of a sudden, the Japanese have lost 4 out of 18 dive bombers and they haven't dropped a bomb either. So the Americans, who had followed Art Brassfield out, they start to wreak destruction as well. So by this time, the battle starts to gravitate to the Yorktown. You can see the Yorktown and you can see all the anti-aircraft fire. Now, the Yorktown is accompanied by 5 destroyers and 2 heavy cruisers, and each one of them had anti-aircraft guns, and they're pumping those 5-inch shells up in the air to try to knock down the Japanese. So they got lucky. They hit one of them. Just as the airplane was starting to disintegrate, he managed to release his bomb. And unfortunately, what happened, the bomb struck the Yorktown, and it pretty much hit the Yorktown the same place that the bomb hit the Yorktown at the Battle of the Coral Sea. So it penetrated all the way down to the fire rooms, and they blew out all the fires in the boiler room. So no power coming from the boilers. The ship, which was doing 30 knots, gradually slowed down to maybe 20 knots, gradually 6 knots. And she finally, Captain Buckmaster and Admiral Fletcher on a bridge, much to their consternation, they're in command of a ship that's dead in the water, with the Japanese with an easy bomber range. So he calls the engine room, he calls back up the Black Gang and says, "Hey, can you give me some power?" And he said, "Well, yeah, bear with us, Admiral. It's pretty serious damage down here. Let's get the fires out. We'll see if we can light the boilers off." So in the meantime, they order the damage control guys to get up on the flight deck and patch that big hole in the flight deck. So they all scramble up with hammers and nails. And some of them carried boards and everything. And there's the Yorktown on fire. So the race is on. Can they put out the fires? Can they get the ship started again? Because there are probably more Japanese. We haven't seen any torpedo planes. We know they're out there. So in the meantime, the American planes start to come back. And of course, all of a sudden they realize, well, we can't land on the Yorktown. So they know that the Enterprise and the Hornet are close enough. So they just motor on over to them. And of course, Max Leslie, who's flying a Dauntless, and he's been flying for a while, and his plane is completely out of fuel. So he ditches alongside one of the ships. But they managed to recover most of the planes that had struck at the Japanese Navy that survived the attack on the flat tops. Of course, Lieutenant or Admiral Tominaga has not been idle. All this was going on. He's got 6 torpedo planes. He's got another 6 fighters. So he plans to throw those at the Yorktown or an American carrier out there somewhere. So Tominaga's roaming the flight deck. And he says, the mechanic comes up to him and says, Lieutenant, you can't fly this airplane. Lieutenant Tominaga says, "Why not, son?" He says, "You've got no left fuel tank. They've completely shredded that fuel tank on your left fuel tank." He said, "Well, don't worry about it. I'll just fuel her up. I'll bring her back. I'll just lean out the mixture. I'll keep the airplane into the air until I can get back to the ship." So, of course, the wrench turner, he looks and kind of scratches his head and says, "Okay, whatever you say, you're the boss." So they hang a torpedo on Tominaga's airplane, and they spot the planes on the deck. And about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they launch Japanese planes off as well to see if they can do further damage to the American ships. And as you would say, the Japanese are saying, "Our boys are in the air." Get dry here. So about 2:45, the Japanese finally show up at the Yorktown. Once again, they show up, and the Americans vector their airplanes out. And of course, there probably aren't quite as many as there were earlier. Some of them are also guarding the Yorktown, guarding Enterprise and the Hornet. They probably could have been better served to guard the Yorktown as well, but the Spruance was just being careful, so he husbanded his airplanes around his ships, while about 8 Wildcats go after the 6 fighters and 10 torpedo planes that are coming up on the Yorktown. So the Yorktown fighters immediately moved to the attack of the 6 fighters are there, or 10 torpedo planes. There are 5 coming in from the right side. There are 5 coming in from the left side. And what they're trying to do is get what they call an anvil attack. If this is the ship hull, you've got 5s coming in from this direction. You've got 5 coming from this direction. It doesn't matter which direction you turn your hull, you're going to be exposing yourself to the torpedoes coming in from one side or the other. They called it the anvil attack. And of course, Buckmaster was sitting there, and all of a sudden, the back gang calls him up and says, "Skipper, we've got power." So in the meantime, he says, "All right, give me everything you've got." So Yorktown starts to move through the water. She's actually moving fast enough she can actually launch a couple of fighter planes. So she's doing about 19 knots, and of course, you've got the Japanese boring in. So she's not as maneuverable as she would be if she could do 30 knots. So unfortunately, Yorktown was turned in one direction to avoid some of the torpedo planes, and she wandered right into the direction where the torpedo planes were coming. And the torpedo planes smash into the hull of the Yorktown. The ship immediately takes on a 23-degree list. Then it increased to 25. And of course, they can't counter flood because the watertight doors have been smashed as a result of this torpedo attack. So the Yorktown, Buckmaster's on the bridge. He's going, is she going to roll over on me? So he's very concerned about his crew, because if the ship rolls over, his entire crew is going to drown. So he goes, all right, I guess we better consider about abandoning ship. Okay, all is not lost, because while the Yorktown is being punished by the Hiryu, scouting planes flying from the Hornet and flying from the Enterprise have located the survivors of the Kaido Butai. So this one pilot, his lieutenant, is named Sam Adams. So Sam Adams radios, I have a carrier at 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 8 destroyers at such and such a position, such and such a distance from our aircraft carriers. So one of the skippers on the carriers marvel at the accuracy and completeness of the report. So they said, okay, we've got something we can work with. So they immediately proceed to launch dive bombers off of the Enterprise, and a bunch of refugees from the Hornet go with him too. So they've got about 24 airplanes on their way to go look for the Hornet. So this is about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. About 5 o'clock, the Japanese know that the Americans are coming, so they launch a couple of fighter planes to try to intercept them. And of course, that's when Max Leslie, who had lost his bomb early in the morning, made up for it. And he proceeds to the Hiryu. There we go. And they launch a concentration of bombs in rapid succession right on the forepart of the ship. As a result of this attack, you have the Hiryu with a tremendous hole in her flight deck. You can see the damage that the Americans had just wreaked on the Hiryu. So that pretty much finished her. So they succeeded in knocking the Hiryu out of the battle. All right, so returning quickly to the Hornet. I'm sorry, we don't need Macumber for a while yet. Returning to the Yorktown there listing in the water. And Buckmaster, much to his consternation, says, we've got to get these men off the ship. So they immediately abandon ship, go into the water, and life rafts, life jackets, whatever they can lay their hands on, flotsam and jetsam floating in the water to maintain their buoyancy. And so the destroyers and the 2 heavy cruisers move in. They use everything that they have on board the ship that floats to try to pull all these men out of the water. So they succeeded in saving most of the crew. So unfortunately, after abandoning ship, the Yorktown did not sink. She pretty much stayed there. So she's floating, abandoned by her entire crew. So that is essentially how the airstrikes, the American planes flew back to the Enterprise and the Hornet and landed back on her flight deck. And they secured operations for the rest of the day. So the sun went down, and so here's Spruance. He's still got his 2 aircraft carriers, and Japanese are still coming after the planning to hit Midway. So Spruance says, well, where do I want to spend the night? Do I want to spend it out here? Do I want to go closer to Midway? So he couldn't really make up his mind. So he thought, well, if I'm the Japanese admiral, I would probably try to send my ships in to find the American ships and force them into a night action. I've got these 2 battleships. I don't think there are any battleships the Americans have. So if I can find their task forces, I can slaughter them with my surface ships. So Spruance shaped a course to the east till about 2 o'clock in the morning. About 2 o'clock, he reversed course to see if he could mop up the survivors. So in the meantime, the Japanese, they've got 6 heavy cruisers, the same class of the Mikuma. If we can get that up there now. All right, thank you, Rick. You notice they have 6 8-inchers forward and another 4 8-inchers aft. And these cruisers were really fairly new ships. They were just built in the last 5 or 6 years. They were probably most heavily armed cruisers in the Japanese Navy. And what they wanted the Japanese Admiral Kurita to do was approach the island of Midway and bombard Midway with, all right, give you some idea how big these ships are. Here's a guy hanging off the side of the ship. I don't know what he's doing, but he's definitely human. So Yamamoto wanted Kurita to approach Midway and really lay it on thick with those 8-inchers. And then the next day, the attack transports would show up and hopefully they could launch an invasion of Midway. So a little bit later, he thinks about it. Wait a minute, I've just lost every single aircraft carrier I've got. The only aircraft carrier of any size I have, which is Suihu, is with my ships. And they're about 600 miles behind where the Kaido Butai just got wiped out. I'm not sure that I want to do that. So he orders most of his ships to head north to join the Aleutian fleet. So he says, I've changed my mind. So he radios Admiral Kurita and says, all right, turn around and head away from Midway. So they're sailing west in a westerly direction, and it's dark. And all of a sudden, the Japanese in the lead ship spotted an American submarine, USS Tambor. So he orders a change of course. So the first ship changes course, the second goes to where he saw the first ship turn, he turns as well. So the third ship follows the third one. Of course, the Mikuma somehow missed a signal and plows into the back of the Mogami. So he takes a big slice out of the aft end of the Mogami. So both of these ships are crippled, and they're only about 200 miles west of Midway, and there are a couple of lamb ducks sitting in the water. So the sunrise on the 5th, the Japanese launch some scout planes. The Tona and the Chikuma are still doing their job. They happen to go out and they find out, uh-oh, there's still 2 American aircraft carriers. I thought we sank 2 carriers yesterday. Where are these? Are these Americans magicians? Where are they getting these ships from? So as a result, the Japanese scout plane not only locates the 2 American carriers, they also locate USS Yorktown, which is floating dead in the water. So it radios all this information back to the task force. They relay that information to Admiral Yamamoto. So he calls the Japanese I-168, which had surfaced off the island of Midway the night before and threw a few shells at the island. But then when the counter battery started to arrive around the ship, he decided he better get out of there. So he left, but he's still in the general area. So Yamamoto issues the order. he says, to the captain of the I-168, find that American aircraft carrier and sink it. So he has his orders. So it's now the 6th of June. The Americans know where the Mogami and the Makuma are. The planes flying from Midway actually struck at the Makuma the day before, and one of the was a Marine captain. He was flying an old obsolete Vindicator / dive bomber, and he was struck. So he figured, well, I'm not going to make it back to Midway, so I'll do as much damage as I can. So he crashes his airplane into the uppermost turret on the back of the Makuma. As a result, he started fires on board the ship because it was very close to the hangar deck. And of course, the airplanes were probably involved too. And all of a sudden, the Makuma is in really sorry shape. So she is essentially a sitting duck, and the American airplanes decide they're going to see if they can do something about the Makuma. So the Enterprise and the Hornet launched their own airstrikes against the Makuma and the Mogami. And they hit both ships. They also land another bomb on the fantail of one of the escorting destroyers, and they work over the Makuma so badly that she will eventually sink. So if we can return to the Yorktown, which is still floating as a derelict out in the Pacific. So Buckmaster has an idea. He says, all right, I'm calling for volunteers. I want some men to go back aboard the ship. We're going to see if we can save the Yorktown. So they all board the ship. They start doing what they can to lighten the load off the ship. They know that there's a fleet tug coming out from Pearl Harbor. They want to take the Yorktown into tow and haul it back to Pearl Harbor and effect repairs on it so that they can still have this aircraft carrier to return it to the fight later in the war once repairs are effected. So unfortunately, what they hadn't counted on was the Japanese staying in the area. Submarine I-168 eventually was scouting around, gradually pokes his periscope out of the water. He spots the Yorktown, so he starts his attack run. So the Yorktown is surrounded by 5 destroyers, one of which is the Hammond. The Hammond is tied up along, so that's not the Hammond. Hammond's only got one funnel. There we go. Whoop. That's the Hammond right there. The Hammond is tied up next to the Yorktown. It's supplying electrical power to the Yorktown so that they can operate machinery that they need to run any power tools that they may have, effect repairs, and hopefully get the Yorktown underway again, relate to quarters. But unfortunately, there's too much damage. So they're dependent upon the tugboat coming out from Pearl Harbor to save the ship. But the Japanese, of course, had other ideas, so they launch a spread of 4 torpedoes. One hits the Hammond. She probably hits her right around the smokestack, maybe a little bit astern of that. The Hammond splits in 2 and sinks. The other 2 torpedoes crash into the Yorktown. And eventually, Bookmasters decide the jig is up. All right, men, abandon ship. We don't want you going down with this thing if it sinks. So they all go over the side again, and the Yorktown pretty much, the Japanese succeeded in doing something the Americans couldn't do. She was on a fairly even keel as she settled in the water. She stayed afloat until the 7th, and then finally, fighting the battle of the water, eventually filling the hull. The valiant Yorktown, after a military career of about 8 years serving the United States Navy, and helping win the Battle of Midway, she sank. We have a picture of the Yorktown on its way down there, Mr. Engineer, sir. There we go. There she goes. I'm sure there wasn't a dry eye in the place as the Pacific finally claimed Yorktown. So she stayed on the bottom, unknown. And about that time, a guy by the name of Bob Ballard shows up, and Mr. Ballard launched his submersibles to go down to see if he can find the Yorktown. So they're using sonar. They have a pretty good idea where he is. So they first start mowing the lawn to get a rough idea and see if they get a sonar return. And let's see what they found. Right there's the Yorktown sitting on the bottom. First people to lay eyes on that since it's sinking at the Battle of Midway. Picture on the left side is the bridge. The picture on the right side shows an anti-aircraft position. All right, I know I've been talking for a little bit now. I think it's almost time for me to shut up. So what can we take away from the Battle of Midway? Well, the loss of those 4 aircraft carriers really, the loss of the 4 aircraft carriers really deprived the Japanese of any strategic move that they could make. They no longer had the flexibility they had when the war broke out. And you say, well, the United States lost an aircraft carrier. Well, if you remember the words of General Yamamoto, he said, the industrial might of the United States, the carrier that was sunk, there was another Yorktown in the water, and it was out in the Pacific fighting in the middle of 1943. There would not be another Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, or Suryu. They would all be unreplaced. The Japanese could not replace the aircraft carriers. They could not replace the airplanes, the men that flew those airplanes, and they could not replace the men who fixed the aircraft carriers. They just not have the mechanical aptitude to fix it, even though the war would go on for another 3 years. The United States has started its march across the Pacific. They would only end up until they were launching airstrikes against Japan. The sacrifice of the torpedo bombers, the American torpedo bombers, what it did, it succeeded in luring the Japanese combat air patrol down to the sea level, leaving the skies above the Kaido Butai free of defending fighters. As a result, there was nothing there to stop the Americans from launching their dive bomber attacks. They came down unmolested to destroy the Japanese ships. I know I talked for a long time, but if anybody has any questions that they would like to ask, I'd be more than happy to answer them. Just speak up.
Andrew Charles,
Yeah,
have they tried to even like bring the ships back up that have sank?
no. That would be too expensive to do anything like that. Aaron.
Well, Chuck, thank you very much. Thanks for that talk and all the stuff you put together. Rick, thank you very much for making it work. Anybody have any questions at this point?
I just want to say I am so impressed. I've never seen anything like this before. And I just can't believe how, I don't know, how knowledgeable. I'm just impressed beyond belief. Thank you. Thank you. Good.
All right, well,
Thank you.
while I've got you on here, is this something you'd like to see more of? Did you like the presentation?
It's just so beyond anything that I'm familiar with, and I just like expanding my knowledge. Yeah, it's very interesting.
All right, well, thank you for the kind words.
Sure, you bet. Thank you.
Very impressive.
You bet.
Impressive. Good job.
Yeah,
There
Charlie?
weren't any interruptions with reference to the feed or anything else, so your tech guys really did a great job with this.
Kudos, Rick, kudos.
Yes, thank you, Rick.
Thank you.
Well, we hope to do this again next month, and probably for another few months until hopefully things open up in the summer or something. So we'll put the word out by the end of February, at least, as to what the talk is going to be in March. And we hope to see some of you on our Wednesday afternoon Zoom meetings. And again, Rick is doing an amazing job of doing all this stuff for us. So thank you very much, Rick. I don't know where we'd be without these Zoom things. Anybody else have
29
any other,
tonight.
any other
29.
questions? Okay, well, thank you very much.
Sure. Bye-bye.
We'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you for
Thank you.
Thanks, Chuck. Thanks, Rick.
Good job, Chuck.
Take care.
All right, thank you all, one and all,
Thank
for your
you.
attention. and your
Thank you, Charles.
indulgence.
Chuck, are you home or are you down the airport?
I am home.
Okay. All right. We're only 2 doors away. All right. See you on the next snow shovel.
Thanks.
Good
Okay.
night.
Good
Take
night.
care.
Good night.